and foremost, as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, I have been focused over the course of the past several weeks on the crisis in Gaza and the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. I just left a classified briefing for the Foreign Relations Committee on the Ukraine crisis. And I'm happy to talk about a broad array of domestic topics, but maybe I'll just spend my time at the outset talking about where we are in Gaza, where we are on Ukraine. First on Ukraine, listen, I will hold up my anti-war CV against anybody's. I ran for Congress in 2006 as an opponent of the Iraq War. I was supportive of President Biden's decision to leave Afghanistan. I created in some ways the movement in Congress to get the United States out of the Yemen war. But there are some just wars. And the war in Ukraine is not just a just war, an important war, but one that really is going to decide the scope of the world order for the next 50 years. We have obviously benefited from 70 years of post-World War II norms in which big countries, by and large, don't get to change their borders by invading smaller countries. Russia is trying to destroy that norm. And the consequences, first and foremost, if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, is likely that Russia does not stop at Ukraine. It moves into a NATO country, and it's the United States directly at war with Russia. That is cataclysmic to nuclear powers fighting each other. But China is paying close attention to what happens in Ukraine. They clearly have designs on Taiwan. And I think there's no question that what happens in Ukraine impacts their willingness and timeline on an invasion of Taiwan. The United States benefits from this relative state-on-state stability. It's how our economy is powered. It's how we protect ourselves. And so to me, this is a war worth fighting. And this is not Afghanistan. This is not Iraq. It's not Vietnam. It's not Korea. Ukraine isn't asking for Americans to fight on their behalf. They are simply asking for us to contribute part of the cost. That's a pretty wise investment. In Israel, the dynamic is more complicated and more nuanced, sitting on top of decades of conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. But the moral imperative doesn't seem much more confusing to me. What Hamas did on October 7th is brutal. It's barbaric. It's kind of amazing to me that a lot of the world has already put it in its rear view mirror, 1,400 Israelis dead. And, the United States has a obligation as Israel's best friend to help, but other terrorist groups that have designs on the United States are watching. And if we don't get this right, if Hamas doesn't pay a price, if they aren't held accountable, the United States is at risk as well. Now, I'm heartbroken and angry at the amount of civilian casualty in Gaza. Reports overnight of a refugee camp being bombed. Israel has to do better. And the United States has to press Israel, not just to let humanitarian aid in, but to be much more careful about their targeting, especially in southern Gaza, where they have told Palestinians to move to. Again, it's not just a moral imperative to stop civilian casualties, but as we've seen in Afghanistan, if you are too permissive about how many civilians are harmed, that just provides fodder for the terrorist groups. You can't beat Hamas if you are killing 1,000 plus Palestinian civilians every week. So we've had tough conversations with Israel. We'll continue to have tough conversations with them. We'll ask these questions as we're reviewing the funding bill that's coming before Congress right now. Lastly, let me just say a word on what's happening in Congress. And it's not good news. I think we need to fund Ukraine and Israel. And they're not comparable numbers. Israel needs a relatively small amount of funding, largely to replenish the Iron Dome compared to what Ukraine needs. But we're having a hard time building consensus to do that. in large part because Republicans in the House and the Senate are insisting that provisions be added to this emergency funding bill that don't have anything to do with Ukraine or Israel. The president has actually requested a bigger supplemental that includes some funding for the border, but it's a funding bill. The minute that you start making policy on that bill, it becomes much more difficult. So Republicans in the Senate are asking for there to be immigration reform as part of this package. I want immigration reform. I've been part of a lot of those discussions. I just am not sure we can get that done in time to get the aid to Israel and Ukraine when they need it. In the House, as you saw yesterday, they released a bill that repeals part of the Inflation Reduction Act. This is resources for the IRS to set up a new filing system for lower income, middle income taxpayers, and also a more robust process to make sure that higher income taxpayers are actually filing their taxes. And that to me, is not helpful to go back and debate again the Inflation Reduction Act. I just think that's a difficult thing to do in the midst of trying to address these two crises. So we are not as close as we should be to sort of having this consensus. I'm always willing to talk to my Republican colleagues about what they need, but I wish we were just able to come together and make a decision to support Israel and Ukraine, and perhaps do some funding work on the border to address the crisis there. The bigger this package becomes, with more and more policy attached to it, the harder it gets to pass. The very last thing to say is this: thank you for giving me the chance to do this job. I feel like this is a gift every single day. I just, I felt a calling to public service a long time ago, and I'm in a little different place in the Senate today than I was when I first got here, in part because of the gun violence bill that I wrote last year with Republicans, the first anti-gun violence bill of any significance in 30 years, and passed with bipartisan support. I now, have a lot of relationships and credibility with Republicans. I get sort of dragged into the room to try to solve some of these big, tough problems that need bipartisan consensus. And so I'm, very much in, daily negotiations on trying to get this big supplemental package done, and trying to really listen to Republicans about what they need to get that across the finish line. And so, for me, that's a rewarding, new part of my work. I've always done bipartisan work, but now, I hope to think that I, can be part of the glue that holds the Senate together at times of crisis like this. So I'll stop there. Really eager to have a discussion for a little while with all of you. Thanks for once again inviting me, and for being very flexible with my schedule.
Questions?
Good morning, Senator. Thank you very much for spending the time with us. When it comes to the idea of making sure that the terrorist organizations around the world, see us getting it right, one of the things that seems to be an issue and is acknowledged by Border Patrol is the number of terrorists, potential terrorists, some of whom were on the terrorist watch list, who they caught coming across that southern border. And one of the things that I think doesn't do this administration any favors is Mayorkas getting up there and saying everything's under control. What do you think you could do in the short term? I think it's a little too late. Some of these guys are already in here, and we're going to have to watch that carefully. What could you do to stop that very, very quickly?
Yeah, one of my responsibilities in the Senate is I chair the committee that writes the budget for the Department of Homeland Security, including our border operations, and so I'm deeply involved in conversations about how to properly fund security at our border. What we have seen starting in 2019 is a fundamental change in the mechanisms of migration. It used to be that the people who showed up on the southern border were largely coming from Mexico, northern triangle countries, sometimes all the way up from South America. The traffickers have figured out that there's no reason for them to limit their reach to the Western Hemisphere. People are willing to pay enormous sums of money to be trafficked to the United States from everywhere. And so a lot of what has driven this dramatic increase in numbers at the border is that the traffickers now have a worldwide distribution and marketing effort. So I go down to the border a lot. Last time, for instance, I was in the Yuma section, which is where you see a lot of people crossing. There were more, the day that I was there were more Russians crossing in the Yuma sector than there were Mexicans. That's just absolutely extraordinary. And if you look at the day-to-day numbers, yes, still a lot of people from South America, still Nicaraguans and Hondurans showing up. But what's driving the increased numbers is the fact that now it's Indians, it's Russians, it's Ukrainians, it's Bangladeshis, Haitians, Cubans, all finding their way into the continent, largely through South America, up through the Darien Gap and into the United States. Many of those countries don't take their citizens back. We have no ability to move them back to their home country. That complicates the situation greatly. Russia is one of those countries. And so Mexico won't take them either. So once they cross into the United States, we are in a very difficult legal and logistic position because there's no mechanism to turn them back around. But as you referenced, many of these people are presenting with asylum claims, but they are not political refugees. They are economic refugees. They're coming here for a better life. And so one of the things I am very hard at work on is changing the process of applying for asylum to much more quickly come to a conclusion as to whether that individual qualifies or doesn't qualify. Right now, they get let into the country. That process can take up to 10 years, which is far too long and makes people furious, rightly so in this country. But that's the law. And so, you can blame President Biden for this, but President Biden is administering the law, and the law never contemplated this many people showing up at the border. And so the law has to be changed to more quickly and more efficiently process people right at the border so that you can turn people around immediately if they don't have a viable asylum claim. And on the question of terrorists, yes, anytime that you have this number of people crossing, you are going to have some bad people come in. But let's just be clear. The history of terrorists coming into the country is that they don't come in through the southern border. They tend to come in through the visa program and overstay their visas, or they come in through the northern border. So I'm not trying to erase that problem, but I think if we sort of look at the history about how people who want to do harm to this country come in, it does tend to be through Europe, through the visa program, through the northern border, less so through the southern border. Doesn't mean we shouldn't pay attention to it, but those are just the numbers.
Senator, do you see any way out of this current logjam blocking military appointments? It's been going on for several months now, as you know. A trickle of appointments have come through. But is there any way that you see that the Senate will ease its path forward? So,
this is Senator Tuberville who objects to, who is not supportive of legalized abortion, and so he objects to the Department of Defense allowing access for women to abortion services. That is the law, and so the Department of Defense permits women in the service to have access to abortion services. Historically, if you had a policy objection with the president, individual senators have put a hold on a nominee or two as a means to send a message. Never before has occurred what's happening today, which is that Republican senators who have a policy objection to the president don't hold one nominee that has a relevance to that policy objection. They hold hundreds of nominees, State Department nominees, Justice Department nominees. We can't move anybody through the Senate right now without going through a full process. And a full process for each nominee takes 3 to 4 days. You're talking about 400 promotions in the military. U.S. attorneys, right? There's, we have to approve hundreds of U.S. attorneys. We simply, under the current rules, don't have the time to do that. We just logistically can't do it. And the Senate never operated this way. Unless Republicans are going to stop doing this, and Tuberville gets the sort of most attention, but my colleague J.D. Vance is holding up every U.S. attorney in the entire country because he objects to the way that the Department of Justice is treating Donald Trump. And so we can't get U.S. attorneys confirmed, which is disastrous for our justice system. We're going to have to change the rules. There's a variety of ways that you can change it. Right now, there is a movement afoot on promotions in the military to just be able to bundle promotions together instead of having to do one at a time and each promotion taking 4 days. We would then, bunch together 24, 50, 100 and process them all at the same time. I don't think Congress has ever rejected a military promotion. It's just kind of a historical anachronism that we even, have to confirm promotions. But that's the way that we're going to try to deal with this. But ultimately, this practice of holding up giant groups of nominees over policy objections is brand new in the Senate, and just more evidence that we have to have a more fundamental change of the rules.
Senator, thanks for speaking to us, and thank you for your service. I tuned into CNBC this morning, and Stanley Druckenmiller was on, and he used the term, the federal government needs to stop spending like drunken sailors, as I think is the exact quote. Pointed out that even though most people would say we're post-COVID, federal spending has grown from 20% of GDP. It's now currently 25% of GDP. And that's before these enormous debt costs come in with high interest rates. Is there any hope to entitlement and spending under control in today's Senate?
Yeah, I think it's a really important conversation. And I appreciate you talking about entitlement reform, because if you look at non-defense discretionary spending, so you sort of take away Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and defense spending, everything else, right, has remained essentially flat. What has grown is those entitlement programs, defense growing by astronomical numbers every year, and emergency spending. And obviously we did a lot of emergency spending during the pandemic. Some of it still has a tail attached to it, right? A lot of those authorizations have continued. So we have continued to spend some of those dollars. So the reason that those numbers are very big right now is because of entitlements, but largely because of those COVID expenditures, which are wrapping up, but have continued through 2022 in particular. There's a lot of things we can talk about here, but I will, maybe reference one really important change that is a little out of the box. So we have made, many attempts to cut Medicare and Medicaid spending. And every single time we do that, a massive lobbying campaign financed through billions of dollars is set up to try to stop us from cutting money in those accounts. So for instance, we just started to put the Medicare program in the position of negotiating on behalf of all Medicare beneficiaries the price of drugs. And we passed that by one vote. Why? Because the drug companies set up just gigantic lobbying campaigns and legal campaigns to stop that. There's such vested interest in Medicaid and Medicare, so many people that are making so much money off of those programs, that anytime that we try to, push back, this, enormous political operation springs up. And I'm not saying that that's an excuse not to do it. It just becomes a lot harder when, members of Congress have billions of dollars worth of ads running against them. So it's a long way of saying one of the ways that you get serious about deficit and debt reduction is campaign finance reform. Right? Machiavelli, told you a long time ago that it's the change agents that have the hardest time, that the status quo is always more powerful. And the status quo on entitlement spending has a ton of money behind it. And so if you want to empower people like me who do want to reduce the amount of money we're spending on those programs, then you've got to put us in a fair fight. And right now, politically, it's just not a fair fight. We've got to have campaign finance reform get a lot of this dark money, out of campaigns and out of issue politics.
Senator, it's been terrific watching you maintain both the energy, tenacity, and integrity in dealing with the gun violence issue. What do you realistically think is the next achievement along a line toward greater safety against gun violence? Not necessarily assuming there's some dramatic shift in the composition of the House and Senate, because it will be close regardless of who wins. But what do you see as reasonable in terms of what can come next?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I just think this is such a critical imperative for the country. I understand that we sort of view this problem of gun violence largely through the prisms of mass shootings and, of course, another awful one in Maine. But I live in the south end of Hartford, so I live in a sort of violent neighborhood compared to the rest of the country in the south end of Hartford, and I have a relationship with a school there, a middle school, and I go down to the middle school and I meet with these kids whenever I can. And to those kids in the south end of Hartford, school is the safe place. What they mostly want to talk to me about when I'm there is how fearful for their life they are walking to and from school, how on the weekends their parents don't let them out of the house. They literally just sit inside their house all weekend. They can't go outside with their friends because of how dangerous their parents believe it is. And to an extent, they are right. We are losing a generation of kids in low-income neighborhoods. I mean, just losing them. These kids, they show up to school with such trauma that they cannot learn. They cannot build positive relationships. And so we need to understand that the scope of the gun violence epidemic in this country is so much bigger than the 110 people who die every day from guns. It is literally millions of children, not children in Darien, not children where I grew up in Wethersfield, but children in the east end of Bridgeport and the south end of Hartford, whose brains are literally being fried by the trauma of all this. So obviously, I think we are going to pass an assault weapons ban and a universal background checks bill in the next 5 to 10 years. I just see this movement heading only in that direction. But your question is, okay, what can we do in the interim? And I'm obsessive about trying to find bipartisan agreement on this. I got a lot of grief from people on my left last summer who thought that I was letting Republicans off the hook by supporting something that wasn't perfect. That's just not how I work. I think you got to solve as much of a problem as you can, and you got to do it in a bipartisan way. I don't want to win the gun violence issue with only Democrats. I want to convince Republican voters, my colleagues, that they should work with us on this. And by the way, what we did last year, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, is actually working. It's not working on mass shootings, but it's actually working on everyday gun violence. Nobody really knows this because, if you turn on Fox News or frankly, even, MSNBC, sometimes you'll hear this narrative about spiraling violence. Murder rates in this country are down 12% from last summer to this summer. That is an extraordinary one-year decrease. We haven't seen anything like that in a long time, and that is in part because of the bill we passed. What's next? So on assault weapons, we don't have the votes right now to ban assault weapons. So there's a couple things that we could consider doing that might get Republican votes. One is just to raise the age. Right now, you can't buy a pistol in this country anywhere if you're 20, but you can buy an AR-15. That's bananas. We should change that. Second, there's some people taking a look at, requiring a license to buy an assault weapon. Not a shotgun, but if you want to buy an AR-15 or an AR-10, you have to get a license and you have to get some training. That would, greatly limit the number of people who could get their hands on these weapons, that would require a background check as well. So that's potentially something that could get bipartisan support in the near future.
Thank you, Senator. My question, it's a kind of a follow-up to what you just discussed. Why is it so hard to get a ban on AR-15s, assault weapons, which should only be for the military or the police? And you can have all the guns you want, but no assault weapons, period, end of discussion.
I think there's a couple reasons. One is just sort of a practical reality of the gun industry today. The gun industry really relies on those sales in order to drive their profits. While gun ownership has increased in the last few years, broadly, since 1980, there are far fewer households that have guns today than had them 40 years ago. And so the gun industry now relies on selling these really expensive, high margin weapons, the AR-15 platform, in part because they have all sorts of attachments and extras that get sold with them. So the gun industry, which funds the gun lobby, now sort of puts all their eggs in the basket of stopping the ban on assault weapons. And that makes the politics of this a little bit harder. But I think there's something deeper going on, which is that over time, people have really connected this idea of unrestricted gun ownership with the concept of liberty and freedom. And especially in rural and more conservative parts of the country, there is a real sort of connection to American values that comes through unrestricted gun ownership. And the gun industry has been wonderful in kind of marrying together this conversation around American values with gun ownership. And so there's a lot of Americans who feel that if you compromise my ability to own any weapon that I want, you are infringing upon my liberty. And there's a variety of things we need to do about that. But one of the things we need to do is just go back to the founding and talk to people about what our founders thought about gun ownership. I think there was a common law right to gun ownership at our founding. I think the Second Amendment guarantees that. And I actually am at odds with a lot of people on the left in my belief that there is a protection of gun ownership broadly in the Second Amendment. But our founders really thought that the gun had to be regulated. I mean, our founders at the state level had supported lots of gun regulation. They regulated who could own it. They required you to register guns. They restricted your ability to conceal the weapon. So, if you really go back to sort of what our founding fathers thought about guns, yeah, they thought people should own guns, but they thought that should be a pretty heavily regulated right. And, we've just got to do a better job of explaining that to people.
Senator, I have a question, sort of an existential question. I think many of the people in this room and around the state are very worried, have an existential worry about where we are headed. I think people outside of the United States look at what is happening today in Congress and looking at sort of the path for democracy in the United States and are quite concerned about where we are headed. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about whether and how we can achieve the ability for the two parties to cease piling on against each other and try to develop a dialogue, a constructive dialogue where both sides can learn from each other and hopefully come together and compromise on key areas where this country so badly needs solutions to problems that are getting worse.
Yeah. So I'm not going to sit here and defend the functionality of my institution. But I don't believe that the sort of current conventional wisdom that we never work together, that we can't work together, that all we do is fight is true. I think that's a really powerful narrative on cable news and the internet. That's what gets clicks. That's what drives viewers, is just covering us as a bunch of dysfunctional buffoons and only focusing on the times that we disagree. But I can actually chart for you leading up to this last election, a pretty remarkable record of bipartisan agreement on really important issues to the country. It starts during COVID. I mean, people just sort of gloss over this, right? But Congress passed 7 bipartisan COVID relief bills that literally saved the country. The PPP program, which kept millions of small businesses alive. The barbershops, the pizza parlors that people care about in Darien would not be around today if not for that. Our schools would have our schools would have shut down. Our hospitals would have disappeared. All of that happened because Republicans and Democrats knew that there was a crisis, COVID, and we came together and passed stuff. Then in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, well, there are some things that happened with just Democrats, and the Inflation Reduction Act is the primary example. Almost everything else was done through bipartisan agreement. Republicans and Democrats together passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the gun bill, together passed the biggest investment in infrastructure spending in the history of the country, together passed the CHIPS Act, which revitalizes the American microchip industry, together passed the PAC Act, the biggest expansion of veterans benefits, especially to cover trauma and chemical exposure in the history of the country, together passed the Respect for Marriage Act, which guarantees the right to gay marriage in this country. Those are really tough bipartisan compromises that we made, but there's probably never been a period of time. You go from COVID through the first 2 years of the Biden administration where we did more stuff together. And I don't mean to be political here, but that only happens because Democrats are in charge of the House and the Senate. Because there are Republicans who want to work with Democrats, but they only tend to get empowered when Democrats are running the institutions. Particularly, the problem is really in the House, not in the Senate. McConnell is more committed now in the Senate to working in a bipartisan way. In the House, unfortunately, when the Republicans are in charge, you just don't tend to see that outreach to Democrats happening. And so we've got to do better. I mean, we still haven't fixed immigration. We talked about entitlement reform. We have much more to do on healthcare costs. I mean, there's plenty of stuff that's not happening across the aisle. But there was a pretty important period of time where we did do good work together, which shows you that under the right circumstances, we can do good work together. The problem in the House is, a lot of it is a problem of redistricting, of how these districts are cut. I mean, both sides do it. Democratic states create only Democratic districts and Republican states create only Republican districts. And so you got very few districts like the 4th Congressional District, where you've got basically even numbers of Republicans and Democrats. If you have more districts that were swing districts, you get more people elected to the House that actually get a benefit from reaching out across the aisle. And so if we want to fix this, we've all got to do better. And I think I'm more bipartisan than almost anybody else in the Senate. But to make the House more bipartisan, we've got to have redistricting reform, and that's going to either come through legislation or come through, the court system.
Senator Murphy, going back to the Middle East, 2 questions. One, lots of conversation about the role of Iran and how we should hold them accountable or not accountable. I'd like your thoughts on that. And then the other related is the breakdown in the intelligence community as it pertains to both Israel and ourselves in terms of being caught so off guard by what happened on October 7th. Thoughts on what that means and where we are?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's no doubt that neither Israel nor the United States saw coming what happened in Gaza. But, frankly, it shouldn't be that surprising. Our intelligence community is regularly wrong. I mean, I just wish that weren't the case, but they are. They believed Russia would be in Kyiv within 2 weeks. They weren't. Obviously, they were deeply wrong about many important questions in Iraq. There's places where they've been right. They were right that Russia was, getting ready to move into Ukraine. The intelligence community was mostly right about Afghanistan. For the better part of 20 years, the intelligence community told us you are never going to be able to stand up a functioning independent Afghan government or military the minute we leave, whenever it is, the Taliban is returning to power. So I just think it means that you can't construct a national security reality that is dependent on your intelligence telling you when you or your allies are under threat. You've got to spend more time creating the conditions upon which crises are less likely to occur. There is no justification or rationalization for what Hamas did. And there's no guarantee that if we had moved more quickly to a Palestinian state, that Hamas wouldn't have acted as they did, because Hamas doesn't really stand for the creation of a Palestinian state. Hamas stands for the destruction and the murder of the Jewish people. But we certainly we were not serious for a long time about the establishment of a Palestinian state. And that did feed a grievance structure, which ended up benefiting Hamas. And so at the back end of this crisis, we better get serious about two states. That's hard, but it's the only path forward. On Iran, I mean, listen, Hamas doesn't exist if not for Iran. We don't have evidence to suggest that Iran planned or knew about these attacks, but Hamas's all the weapons, all the rockets they use comes from Iran. What we've got to do is get the international community back united on Iran policy. And this is the great tragedy of what Trump did. He pulled out of the nuclear deal, and he shattered this coalition we had. It wasn't just the United States and Europe. We had the US, Europe, China, and Russia together on Iran strategy. And the whole plan was to do the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, and then move on to using that coalition to come after Iran's support for regional proxies. And so we've got to get that coalition back together in order to effectively pressure Iran to move away from its proxy support. So that's part of the mission. But part of the mission also is just destroying Hamas's military capability. If an Iranian proxy is going to engage in this kind of brutal terrorist activity, then they have to be defeated. At least their military capability has to be defeated. I mean, you got to just sort of strength understand strength. And so if you want to have an effective Iran strategy, you got to help Israel eliminate Hamas's military capabilities.
Senator, I'd like you to just elaborate a little bit about what you said before about trying to process people more quickly at the border and to differentiate between those who have a legitimate political asylum assertion and those that are here for economics. What can be done to speed that process? Why has it not been done up till now, and what would it cost?
So in 2013, when I got to the Senate, we passed a comprehensive immigration reform measure that included all the things that we're talking about here, included asylum reform, included more physical supports, physical barriers at the border, more border agents, quicker processing. We passed that with 70 votes in the United States Senate. Republicans and Democrats supporting it. We sent it to the House of Representatives, and the Republican-led House refused to take it up. It's that problem I continue to describe to you, which is that we can find compromise in the Senate, but we can't get it through the House particularly when Republicans are in charge. So we have been trying to get Republicans in the Senate to re-engage with us on a broad reform of our immigration laws. But what they say to me and us is it's going nowhere in the House. McCarthy wasn't going to call it. This guy Johnson's definitely not going to have a debate on a bipartisan immigration reform bill. So I'm not going to stick my neck out. This is what Republicans in the Senate say to us. I'm not going to stick my neck out on a bipartisan controversial immigration reform proposal if the House of Representatives isn't going to consider it. Now, you can go back and say we should have prioritized this issue in 2021 and 2022 when we did have a Democratic House. I think that's a fair critique. I mean, Biden had other priorities, climate, infrastructure, guns, and so immigration just did not rise to, did not ultimately sort of get the attention of Congress at that time. And maybe that's a fair criticism. It should have, but I'm going to stay at it. So I'm deep in these negotiations, trying to get Republicans to commit to a proposal. What would it look like? Right now, what happens, you show up at the border, you have to show that you have a credible fear that if you return to your country, you would be subject to violence. That's not a hard thing to show. And if you show that, you get sort of released and put into a process to have your asylum claim adjudicated. But because we have so few resources in that system and so many people in the system, that process can take 10 years. So there's 3 things you can do about that. One, you can increase the standard to show this, what we call credible fear. You can increase that standard. 2, you can put more resources into the system to process those claims in days, not years. And 3rd, you can recognize that we need people in this country. You see in Darien, in Fairfield County, all of the help wanted signs. We can't operate right now with the kind of tightness in the labor market that we have. But the asylum program is not the way to let people in for work purposes. And so you've got to establish, I think you've got to establish a new visa program in this country, a temporary work visa. Right now we have temporary work visas, but it's only for one employer, right? You can get a temporary work visa, but you have to work for X employer. I think you should have a temporary work visa where the individual can come in and be part of the free labor market, but it's time limited, right? They can be here for 2 years, 5 years, and then they leave, but they can come here and work and not have to try to shoehorn themselves into the asylum system. So those 3 things are what we're talking about. Raise the initial standard, put more resources in to adjudicate claims early, and then just acknowledge that you have to have a broader pathway, a legal pathway to bring people into the United States for work purposes.
Thank you so much.
I think I have time for, I've got to jump off at a quarter after the hour, so I think I have time for one more.
Okay, I'll give you an easy one, and that is asking your help for me to engage in a meaningful discussion for people who come up and remind me that the Russians walked into Crimea during the Obama administration and we did nothing. We then, when Biden came in at the Afghanistan fiasco, Russia walks into Ukraine, invades Ukraine, and now we have the Israeli invasion. And all you hear anymore, particularly on Fox News, is, yes, but in the middle of that for 4 years, nobody did any of this stuff. And nobody would have done any of this stuff under Trump because Democrats historically have a poor track record of defining red lines and holding to red lines. So how do you address that criticism that facts show that all this stuff seemed to happen around the Trump administration, and we're providing him yet one more path to say that re-elect him and none of it will happen in the future, which is clearly both, but it does not address the fact that the Democrats are vulnerable, being the guardians during all these invasions.
Yeah, I mean, I think we tend to have, right, a very American-centric view of the world, and so it must be that everyone orients their international decision-making around who the United States president is. That just isn't always true. So there were lots of bad things that happened under President Trump. This migration surge at the southern border started under President Trump. I don't know that I blame him for that. I think that there's a lot of factors at play. There were horrendous things that happened inside Syria during Trump's presidency, the entrance of Turkey into that war, the abandonment of our Kurdish allies there. Iran's provocative behavior began during the Trump administration. It was during the Trump administration that Iran started shooting at U.S. troops in Iraq and started attacking Saudi oil facilities. So I don't necessarily know that I buy this idea that one president is creating a permission structure and another president isn't. I think the world these days is a pretty difficult place, and it's a difficult place under Democratic and Republican administrations. I guess I wish, that we got back to the place in which, politics, if not stopped at the water's edge, became a little bit less calcified. And so, for me, I opposed Trump when I thought he was wrong on a foreign policy matter, and I supported him when I thought he was right. I mean, I thought, frankly, he was not wrong to start engaging with the Taliban to negotiate our way out of Afghanistan. There are things that I think President Biden has been wrong on, and I've raised those issues when I believe the president is wrong. But I try to view foreign policy not through a political prism, but through a prism of just what I think is right and wrong for national security interests. We'll have plenty of time to litigate Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. I don't think there'll be any shortage of time for the American people to process who's the better choice. I guess when I think about foreign policy as a senator, I just try to think of it in as apolitical manner as I can in the best traditions of this country. I have William Fulbright's desk in the United States Senate. So when I open up that desk, I see Fulbright's signature in that desk. And, that was a guy who stood up at a time when few other people were standing up to say that the war in Iraq, the war in Vietnam was a disaster for U.S. security, even though it was a Democratic president. And, that's something I think about all the time. Listen, just last thing to say is obviously my office is here to help in any way that I can. So please keep in touch with me. Your family, friends, neighbors have issues of veterans benefits, immigration benefits, Medicare, whatever it is, let us know. And then just to square the circle on this question of the crises overseas, as people in this country are hurting right now. The threats to Jewish communities and the threats to Muslim communities are sky high. And so as you pick up anything that looks frightful or dangerous, please make sure that we know about it and the law enforcement knows about it. We do not want this to spill over into violence in the United States. That is always a risk, and that requires all of our vigilance and just all of our understanding. To do that outreach to our Jewish American friends, our Muslim American friends, just to make sure that they know that we're there and thinking of them at this very difficult time. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate you having me.